The war in Ukraine has been one of the most devastating conflicts in recent history. The consequences of this war have not only been felt politically and militarily but have also deeply affected the everyday lives of millions of civilians. Since the conflict began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and escalated dramatically in 2022 with a full-scale invasion by Russia, the humanitarian toll has been immense. While much of the focus in the media has been on military strategies and geopolitical implications, it's crucial to remember the real, human cost of this war. For the people of Ukraine, the conflict has meant displacement, loss of loved ones, physical and emotional trauma, economic hardship, and a life upended. This video delves into the profound impact of the war on Ukrainian civilians, addressing the many facets of their suffering, resilience, and hopes for the future. As of early 2023, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, estimates that over 14 million people have been displaced by the war in Ukraine. This includes both internally displaced people, IDPs, and those who have fled the country seeking asylum abroad. These civilians have left behind their homes, jobs, communities, and in many cases, family members, in search of safety. The displacement has created an enormous humanitarian crisis. Neighboring countries like Poland, Hungary, Moldova, and Slovakia have taken in millions of refugees, while countries further afield in Europe and beyond have also opened their doors. But even as many have found refuge, the challenges for displaced Ukrainians are far from over. Refugees face difficulties in accessing basic services such as healthcare, education, and housing in their host countries. Language barriers, legal challenges, and the emotional toll of being separated from their homeland have created a situation where many feel they are living in limbo. Moreover, the war has caused immense internal displacement, with entire regions in eastern and southern Ukraine becoming uninhabitable due to fighting. For those who remain within the country, many live in temporary shelters or makeshift housing. Their future remains uncertain, as returning home to areas near the front lines is either impossible or unsafe. The human cost of the war in Ukraine is staggering. While exact numbers are difficult to ascertain, estimates suggest that tens of thousands of civilians have been killed since the conflict began, with many more injured. Civilians have been caught in the crossfire, killed by indiscriminate shelling, airstrikes, or targeted attacks on residential areas. The war has led to widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, and homes. Entire towns and cities have been reduced to rubble, with the eastern city of Mariupol serving as a harrowing example. Once a bustling port city, Mariupol became a symbol of resistance as it withstood a brutal siege, but it also became a graveyard for many civilians trapped in the relentless bombardment. The psychological scars of losing loved ones, witnessing atrocities, or simply living under constant threat of violence are profound. The mental health crisis in Ukraine is worsening, with trauma, anxiety, and depression prevalent among civilians, especially children. Children are perhaps the most vulnerable group affected by the war. The UN reports that hundreds of children have been killed or wounded, but the indirect consequences of the war on children are even more widespread. Schools across Ukraine have been destroyed, damaged, or forced to close due to safety concerns. Many children have missed out on years of education, which threatens to create a lost generation if steps are not taken to ensure access to learning. Beyond education, the emotional and psychological impact on children is severe. Many children have lost parents or siblings, and those who have survived the fighting often bear the invisible wounds of trauma. Bomb shelters have become a part of daily life for many Ukrainian children, as have the sounds of air raid sirens and explosions. Organizations like UNICEF and Save the Children have stepped in to provide humanitarian aid, psychological support, and educational programs for displaced and traumatized children. Still, the scale of the crisis means that many needs remain unmet. One of the most devastating effects of the war has been the collapse of healthcare systems in conflict zones. Hospitals and medical facilities have been targeted or destroyed, and medical supplies have become scarce. Civilians in areas under siege or heavy bombardment are often unable to access necessary medical care. The COVID-19 pandemic had already strained Ukraine's healthcare system, and the war has only made things worse. Vulnerable populations, such as the elderly and those with chronic illnesses, face heightened risks. There have been reports of doctors and nurses operating under dire conditions, sometimes without electricity or running water, and of patients being treated in basements and makeshift medical facilities. In some areas, pregnant women have had to give birth in underground shelters, while others have been forced to flee hospitals mid-labor due to airstrikes. International humanitarian organizations have worked tirelessly to deliver medical supplies and set up mobile clinics, but the challenges of delivering aid to frontline areas remain immense. The war has brought the Ukrainian economy to its knees. Before the conflict escalated in 2022, Ukraine was already one of the poorest countries in Europe. The war has further exacerbated the economic situation, plunging millions into poverty. Infrastructure damage, the loss of jobs, and disruptions to agriculture and industry have had devastating effects. The agricultural sector, which is crucial to Ukraine's economy and a key global food supplier, has been severely impacted. Ukraine is one of the world's largest producers of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil, and the war has disrupted planting and harvesting cycles, as well as export routes. The blockade of ports and the destruction of farmland have led to food shortages both within Ukraine and globally, contributing to rising food prices. Civilians in Ukraine are facing skyrocketing prices for basic goods, with inflation reaching levels not seen in decades. Many families have lost their primary source of income and are now reliant on humanitarian aid for survival. Despite international financial assistance and the resilience of the Ukrainian people, the long-term economic consequences of the war are expected to be profound. Ukrainian women have played a critical role during the war, both as civilians and in direct support of the war effort. Many women have taken on roles traditionally held by men, especially as male family members have been called to serve in the military. Women have been at the forefront of humanitarian efforts, organizing relief for displaced people, caring for children, and providing psychological support for survivors of violence. At the same time, women have also been disproportionately affected by the war. Women make up the majority of refugees, and they face unique challenges, including the risk of gender-based violence, trafficking, and exploitation. The war has also led to a rise in domestic violence, as the stresses of conflict and displacement exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. International organizations have recognized the importance of supporting women during the war and have launched programs aimed at providing women with economic opportunities, protection from violence, and access to healthcare. However, the scale of the problem is enormous, and much work remains to be done to protect and empower women in Ukraine. The war has not only had a profound impact on Ukrainian civilians but also on Ukraine's cultural heritage. Many historical and cultural sites have been damaged or destroyed in the fighting. The deliberate targeting of cultural landmarks, including churches, museums, and libraries, has been seen by many as an attempt to erase Ukrainian identity. For Ukrainians, the war has deepened their sense of national pride and identity. Despite the hardships, there has been a resurgence of patriotism, with civilians contributing to the war effort in any way they can. Volunteers have organized to support the military, distribute food and medical supplies, and rebuild communities. The Ukrainian language, traditions, and cultural expressions have taken on new significance as symbols of resistance and resilience. The international community has responded to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine with an outpouring of support. Governments, non-governmental organizations, and individuals have donated billions of dollars in aid to support Ukrainian civilians, including food, medicine, shelter, and financial assistance. Countries like Poland and Germany have opened their borders to Ukrainian refugees, while international organizations like the International Red Cross, the World Food Programme, and Médecins Sans Frontières have been on the ground providing life-saving services. In addition to material support, the global outcry over the war has led to widespread condemnation of the aggressors and sanctions against those responsible for the violence. However, for many Ukrainians, the question remains: will this support be enough to end the war and ensure a lasting peace? Despite the immense suffering caused by the war, the Ukrainian people have demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Communities have come together to support one another, and there is a strong desire to rebuild once the fighting stops. Ukrainian civilians have shown that they will not be defeated, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The road to recovery, however, will be long and difficult. Rebuilding homes, infrastructure, and institutions will require significant investment, both from Ukraine and the international community. There is also the emotional and psychological healing that must take place, particularly for those who have experienced the trauma of war. For many Ukrainians, the hope is that the war will end soon and that peace will prevail. But even as they look to the future, they remain acutely aware of the challenges ahead. The impact of the war on Ukrainian civilians will be felt for generations to come, and the international community must continue to stand with Ukraine in its time of need. The war in Ukraine has forever changed the lives of millions of civilians. It has brought death, destruction, and displacement on a scale not seen in Europe since World War II. And yet, the spirit of the Ukrainian people remains unbroken. While the war has inflicted immense suffering, it has also fostered solidarity, resilience, and an unshakable belief in the future of their nation. As the war continues, the world must not forget the human cost of this conflict and must do everything in its power to support the civilians of Ukraine in their struggle for peace, security, and dignity.